and and today I really have an interesting guest, Stephanie Arnold, which I will soon share with you a little bit about her. I came to a conference in Chicago of a good friend of mine, John Muservi, and what we saw, and then I heard her fascinating story about basically predicting her own death that actually ended up happening, and everything around that. And I thought, wow, this is a crazy story. And I, dug a little bit more into it and asked Stephanie to come and speak with us today and possibly join one of our conferences in the future. So just a couple of words. So Stephanie is an award-winning international best-selling author, inspirational speaker and thought leader on the mission to help others realize that connecting with our sixth sense can not only enhance our lives, but can very well save them. What would you do if your gut kept telling you something that was wrong? Would you listen to it? During the birth of her second child, Stephanie suffered a rare, often fatal condition called amniotic fluid embolism and died on the operating table for 37 seconds, which is the name of her book as well. She currently serves on the board of directors for the AFE Foundation, speaks on patient advocacy to hospitals and medical institutions, offers support to families affected by trauma and surviving against the odds, and has appeared on numerous TV shows, including Good Morning America, the Dr. Oz show, the Today Show, and yesterday I just watched Netflix's TV series that devoted their first episode to her story. And of course, her #1 bestseller, 37 Seconds, the book, has been translated into a dozen languages and is distributed worldwide. And what I will share with you before we start our discussion is this. Let me just make sure that I shared it correctly. Yes.
Do you trust your intuition? Stephanie Arnold saw her own death months before it actually happened.
Stephanie Arnold predicted that she would die during delivery.
You go in to give birth, a healthy baby boy, and seconds later,
did she really die?
This is the real thing. Cardiac arrest.
I could actually see everything that was going on in the operating room.
Stephanie wrote about her near-death experience in the book, 37 Seconds.
I was clinically dead for 37 seconds, but I'm alive now.
This is an awakening.
Congratulations, I know you just sold your screenplay.
Speak up and trust your intuition. It could mean the difference between life and death.
It's an incredible story.
Yep. So, so that's the story of Stephanie. Stephanie, I hope you're with us. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you for being here. As I've mentioned, I heard your amazing story at John Muservi's conference. I have to tell you, as a big horror fan, I'm a big horror fan. That's why I don't have a lot of friends. And that's why
I don't have a lot of friends because I predict things and everybody's like, let me stay out of the light.
I'm like watching the films by myself at night because nobody would. I have to tell you that, even though, it's funny, when I was young, I remember when I was 13 and my brother and my parents were watching a film and the film ended with somebody getting buried. Usually it's the end of the story, it's a drama and he dies. And then I came to my brother and said, it's funny, your movies end where mine just begin. Okay, so my film that would be the opening scene, and now let's tell the story. So I was always, even though I grew up on horror films and all of that, I was always trying to scare myself with whatever, all those Ouija boards and whatever, hoping to get scared. I've done everything, and I didn't see anything really. And I was very skeptical. I said, I'm watching, this stuff, but practically I don't, unfortunately I haven't seen anything beyond. And I have a very known family. I think I told you about it yesterday. They told me, a very, very famous family told me, Danny, you know me, I'm not religious. I'm a practical guy. I didn't even keep Shabbat or anything like that. I'm very, very down to earth guy. And then he remarried, and his new wife had these powers, and people came to her that she could tell them stuff. And he said, Danny, I have to tell you, I cannot talk about it with anybody, because if I will, it will be all over the news that I'm nuts. But I'm telling you, there is something there. I know it now. So good morning. And by the way, I mentioned to you as well before, something a little bit weird is that we're doing this, and don't mess with my time zone, on the 11th at 11 EST. And I said, that never happened before either. So good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
And-
The thing is that I tell people it doesn't matter whether you believe, whether you're a hardcore scientist. I'm married to one of the biggest skeptics. He's a PhD from University of Chicago. He's an economist. He's a former Air Force pilot. He's grounded. He's analytical, and our friends are doctors and lawyers and scientists. And so I say it doesn't really matter if you believe, if you lean more towards science or you're more spiritual. The reality is, I know where I lean and I know where other people lean when I talk to them. But the reality is, if you have these kind of knowings, and everybody who's watching this has had this experience at one time or another where you have this knowing, you don't know how you know, you just do. And they happen, and then you're like, that defies logic. But it happened. And all I am here as a witness to our story, and in your face, especially in the medical community, when you talk about health, when you talk about life and death situations, that maybe you should trust your gut or your intuition a little bit more. Whether you are hardwired for this or whether this is coming from a message outside of us, it does not matter. It's coming to you. You're getting the messages. Whether you listen to it or not, it's a whole different story. And I'm here to tell you to listen to it more.
And before we dive into this crazy story, before you also had intuitions and stuff, or this is just the first time that suddenly?
No, as a kid, my grandmother was from Cuba, and so originally from Poland, and then they immigrated to Cuba, and she was known as a santera. So it was like, she was a little witchy, but she believed in extrasensory perceptions, and so she would feel things off of people. And so we all have our lineage, and we all have grandparents and ancestors who have these kind of sixth senses that are stronger than others. And as a kid, I was 10 years old the first time it happened, where we were about 3,000 miles away, and I felt my grandmother's fatal heart attack at that moment. And then I also, when I was like 18, 17, I hugged my uncle, and I knew he was a healthy man, and I knew it would be the last time I would see him, and he died 2 days later. And so there was no understanding. And as a kid, you feel like you're willing it to happen. And if other people have heard of manifestation, it's like they feel like you're manifesting it. So as a kid, if you have no one to talk to, your rabbi tells you, Sarah, don't talk about this, that what you're talking about is Kabbalistic. We don't discuss this, and everything. So when you're told all of that, you compartmentalize it, and you're scared. So you don't want to will it to happen in the future. And I shut it down until this experience.
And you grew up where?
I grew up in South Florida. I grew up in Miami. We belonged to a religious, we belonged to an Orthodox school, but we were not religious by any means. Later in life, I worked for Lubavitch, and I produced Jewish educational documentaries, but it was this feeling that I knew I was spiritual. I knew, and when I lived in Israel, when I was 16, I went to high school in Israel for a short time. And then when I came back, part of it was wanting more connected roots in Eretz Israel, so I became more religious that way, but wanting to understand more of the vibration. I went to China and worked with these Taoist priests to understand, what this cranial sacral work that they're doing, Eastern philosophy, medicine, because, I was feeling things off of people and I couldn't understand what that was. And then, working with shamans in, Mexico to understand different cultures and how they approach healing. And that fascinated me and still fascinates me to this day.
And then, so you get married, you have a happy life. I met your husband as well.
So I met my husband through a matchmaker, through the Yenta that's on TV on Bravo. And I worked, just for your audience now, I worked in television most of my career. I produced a lot of reality TV. And so I had this great career. I had money in the bank. I had my house. I had my car. So it was like I didn't want for anything, but I had no one to share it with. And I go on this adventure to China. I come back and I'm like, okay, what am I missing? And then I meet the Yenta, and she's like, it would be my pleasure to set you up. And I met Jonathan Arnold. I think when did I meet him? In February of 2008. And then 6 months later, we were married.
Wow.
Yeah. Relocated me to Chicago, which is where my career died. Not me personally. Well, it's also where I technically died and came back. So it's like all of it died in Chicago. And then it was this kind of rebirth. So yeah.
Chicago, that's why we're doing, that's why I was there, because we're doing our first conference in Chicago this year.
Yeah.
That's not, I'll talk about it later. So that was the third time you were giving birth. So let's start with that, right? I mean, you had.
Yeah. So he had a child from a previous relationship. And so she was my stepdaughter, and the first daughter that I gave birth to was after 3 rounds of IVF. So it is so funny because at one time, when I was working at Lubavitch, we filmed a Jewish educational documentary at 770. For your audience who doesn't know that, that's the headquarters of Lubavitch in New York. And I was lucky enough to be one of the only female people inside 770, meeting the Rebbe private. We were filming him. And he when he does any kind of prophecies, he hands you $1 and he gives you a blessing. So he gave me $1, and he's like, and I was 19 at the time. And he said, you'll have difficulty having children, but you will have them. And I said, and I write this in my book, and I'm like, I am 19. I am not having children. I am not getting married. I don't even want this prophecy. I don't care about this. And so then every time I speak at Chabad, I'm like, and I took the $1 and I spent it on a Coke, and they're like, oh. And I'm like, I didn't want this, right? So years later, when I had difficulty having children, I think, okay, IVF, that's very difficult. So I went 3 rounds of IVF, had a live birth with Adina, no complications, no problems, other than the fact that she was too big. So I had to have a C-section. And then Jacob, I got pregnant with him after 4 more rounds. So it was the 7th round. And the pregnancy was fine. It was the first 5 months up to the 20 weeks was no problem. Jonathan took a job as the chief economist for the New York Attorney General's office. So we were splitting our time between New York and Chicago. And, when I did the radiology at the 20-week ultrasound, which is where they determine the quadrants of the heart, the spine, like it's the big ultrasound, they said, oh, you have a placenta previa. And it sat with me wrong. And when you're being told something, it's either a knee-jerk reaction and then you calm down after you research it or whatever. But it was a visceral reaction, like, this is not good. And my husband, who's very logical, was like, honey, we don't have all the information. I don't even know what this is. I said, look, I am special in my blood category. I'm O negative, which is 7% of the population. I said, I don't want to be special in any other category. I don't want any high risk, anything. I said, so what do you do when you're panicked? You become Dr. Google, and I'm looking on the web. What is a placenta previa, which is basically when the placenta is growing on top of the cervix. it's a 1 in 200 risk. So it's very common. And as the uterus grows, usually it will move out of the way so that the birth canal is open. In the worst case scenario, it says, you might need a C-section, right? Because if it's blocking. Okay. And then of course, the researcher and producer in me keeps researching, and it says, okay, in other situations, you can bleed. In really worst case scenario, you can hemorrhage, you need a hysterectomy, and you and the baby can lose your life. And as I read this, it was like a download that was so fast that I was like, this is going to happen to us. The only difference is the baby's going to survive. It was, like I said, a knowing. I knew this was going to happen. So of course, my husband takes the computer. He's like, honey, what you are worried about is a half of a half % chance of happening. You have great prenatal care. You're at great hospitals. I was at Northwestern. I was at NYU. Like it didn't make sense to him. And so I knew dealing with him from a logical side was not going to work. But what I needed to do was I needed data. And so what did I do? I told everybody, if you're online and you are bored and you want to watch the Netflix thing, it's a 15-minute clip on this docuseries called Surviving Death. It tells you the extent of what I did. I mean, I spoke to every nurse, I spoke to every doctor, I had every visit I had, and I saw the doctors more than the average one time a month until you get to last like 6 weeks or 5 weeks. So I saw them every chance I could get. I had blood work up. We had a friend who was a resident or a fellow gynecological oncologist. And he's like, Stephanie, we was talking to Jonathan and I'm like, tell him what's going on. And he's like, Stephanie, I'm not going to waste his time. And I said, can you please tell him? He's like, there's nothing wrong with you. I said, so I take the phone and I said, what happens in the event that I need a hysterectomy during the delivery? He's like, Stephanie, you're not going to need that. I said, I am concerned that my placenta is going to marry itself to the uterus, which is called an accreta, which is what I read. It's what Kim Kardashian had. Not that I need to bring up Kim Kardashian in a family office conference, but there you go. So it marries itself. And if you need that, you need to have the hysterectomy. He's like, you're not going to need, you're not even diagnosed with an accreta. You're diagnosed with a placenta previa. And I said, can you just humor me? And he's like, well, what happens is the OB, if there's a problem like that, then the OB transfers it to maternal fetal medicine. But you don't want an MFM to do it. You want a gynec to do it because they have the most experience with high risk reproductive organ surgeries, and 20% of your blood supply is going to the uterus. So that would constitute a high risk hysterectomy. So I made an appointment with the head of gynec at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Now, mind you, when you're taking intake and a nurse is saying, well, have you been diagnosed with this? What form of reproductive organ cancer do you have? And I am saying I'm a healthy pregnant woman. I haven't been diagnosed with any of it. Why do you want to see the doctor? I just need to see the doctor. So I used whatever skills I could and I got the appointment. And my husband went with me, God bless him, to every single one of my appointments. And so we went into the waiting room and you see women who are suffering from cancer. They have IVs in their arm. They've lost their hair. They are suffering. And I look like this healthy 6.5 month, 7 month pregnant woman and glowing, right? And so Jonathan's like, I am embarrassed to be here. And I said, I don't know what to tell you. Everybody's telling me it's normal, everything's fine. There are no indicators that I am sick, that there's going to be a problem. Maybe this doctor has heard of something. Maybe he's had a patient who said, oh, I had a patient who had premonitions like this, and this is what it ended up being. Because at this point, nobody is giving me, and everybody's seeing this open road, and all I see is 18-wheeler headed straight for me. So we go into the consultation with the gynec and the resident's taking notes. Mrs. Arnold, how can I help you? And I said, well, my placenta previa is going to turn into an accreta. I'm going to need a hysterectomy. And the day that I give birth, I need you to be there to do the hysterectomy. And so the resident stops taking the notes and the doctor sits back. He's like, Mrs. Arnold, have you been on the internet? And I said, why, yes, I have, doctor. I said, but I'm telling you, this is going to happen. And he said, okay, Mrs. Arnold, let's do this. Let's get an MRI. If it's positive for an accreta, we will schedule ourselves for the day that you're having your mandatory C-section, which was at 37 weeks, and we'll take care of it then. And I felt better. And, you know, because now I had something that I could do that might give optics into what was really going on in my system. I do the MRI, and the MRI is negative for an accreta. So my husband says, you should feel better. And I said, I don't, I feel worse, because now I'm running out of people to tell this crazy foreboding story to. So what do you do next? Well, I posted on Facebook, if anybody has my blood type, I'm going to need the blood. I got comments, not because I thought people were going to donate their blood, because I didn't think that that was possible, but maybe, again, somebody in the metaverse would have said, hey, you know, my cousin went through this, or this happened to her.
And at that stage, your husband is completely sure that you are lost your mind.
Out of,
He told his friends, and he talks to them, says, listen,
she's out of her fucking mind.
that's it. You know, I don't know, you know, right?
She's bad. Crazy. She's crazy. And or there's too much testosterone running through her system. You know, in actuality, like he did in one moment think that something was wrong with the baby. Like we're having no indicators that something was wrong with Stephanie, that maybe, even though the amniotic fluid was fine, everything was fine, that maybe there was something happening to the baby, and that's what was sending the signals, which was a fair point. I knew that the baby was fine, but you know, who am I? I'm just somebody with an intuitive mind saying this is going to happen, and everybody thinks I'm crazy. So, so I take to Facebook, I write goodbye letters. I sent goodbye letters to people. I wrote exactly what was going to happen to me in a few months' time, or in like weeks' time. And, you know, one of my last visits to my OB, she said, are you still having the visions? And I said, yes. She said, why don't you have a consultation with anesthesia? Maybe that will calm you down. And so I had a consultation with anesthesia over the phone, and she explained what would happen when I deliver the baby, epidural, where I recover. And I tried one more time. I said, this is what I'm afraid is going to happen. And, you know, at the end of the conversation, she was startled, but she said, you know, Mrs. Arnold, we're in a teaching hospital. We prepare for emergencies all the time. I hope I've helped you. I hope I've helped calm you down. And she said she'll never forget the last words I said to her, which were, it is what it is. Because at that time, it's, you know, I have no one else to talk to. So I'm trying, you know, when they tell you, you know, if you were ever given a terminal illness and you knew exactly when you were going to die, you should enjoy those moments with your family. You should savor those last breaths. You should care and take those moments and just love them deeply. Well, I didn't do any of that. All I did was I was focused on saving my life. So I was panicked, and I was, you know, trying to absorb my 2-year-old Adina at the time, my stepdaughter, who was 8 at the time, or 7 at the time, my husband, just trying to put on a strong face, and then turn my head and be like, what else can I do? What else can I say? Because my husband, in the way his DNA works, was using every tool in his toolbox to calm me down. The data wasn't saying it. So for him, he concluded it was a very low probability that anything.
How did other people react in your circles, like your parents, your siblings, his family?
So, my sister, who had a hysterectomy in her 30s, I just talked to her more like, what happens when you have a hysterectomy? She's like, if you ever have to have a hysterectomy, like she went through the logistics about that. I didn't tell my father what was going on because my father had a weak heart, and I didn't want that to throw him over the edge. Plus there was nothing for them to do. My mother kept asking, is everything okay? Like intuitively, I was like, everything's fine. Cause I didn't want her panic, because my mother, when the shit hit the fan, my mother said things that were just like, which I'll share in a few minutes, were just like, it would have been worse had I told her. But my friends stayed away from me. Like my friends, I had one friend who was pregnant And she felt the fear because it was quite palpable for people who knew me. And she kept saying that she prayed at night that everything was going to be fine, but she had a feeling that she just didn't want to get near it, but she had a feeling that something was happening. I had another friend who later, when everything unfolded, I said, "Were you shocked?" And she said, "No, because you prepared me." And so there were things, you know, so everybody, and then Jonathan's friends and his business associates were all like, "She's gonna be fine. She's panicked," you know, it's all of that. So then I think 36 weeks to the day, Jonathan's in New York at a conference, and my water broke. And, you know, I always say God works in mysterious ways, right? Because it's one thing to hear that your wife flatlines, it's another thing to see it. So, you know, I start bleeding on the kitchen floor, and my nanny and Adina are having breakfast, and, you know, we're cleaning everything up. We get to the car, and my nanny gets into the front driver's seat, and I said, "Get out of the driver's seat, I'm driving." And she's like, "Stephanie, you're bleeding." And I said, "I've had lots of premonitions. Dying in a car accident was not one of them. So get out." So we get to the hospital, and I get triaged, and the doctors come in, and I'm Skype chatting with my husband. And so he's on a plane headed back, he's in the air, and, you know, apparently the anesthesiologist came in to check in on me. The one that I spoke to, I didn't remember, you know, they did the epidural. The doctor comes in, it's like, "The ORs are quiet right now and you've been really stressed. So let's go ahead and take Jacob and to Adina. Your mom will be back with your brother soon." And I hugged her a million times because I was convinced this was going to be the last time I was going to see her. And then I'm typing to Jonathan, and he's like, "I think I'll make it." I said, "They want to take the baby now." And he's like, "Where do I meet you?" And in the process, I'm like, "You've made me the happiest woman in the world. I love you. Please take care of this child. This isn't his fault. You know, please take care of everybody. I know I love you. You've made me the happiest one." Like, I just kept rambling, and he's like, "Where do I meet you?" And I said, "8th floor recovery, hopefully." And they wheel me out down to the OR, and I break down crying. And I tell my doctor again, "There's something wrong. You need to put me under general anesthesia." And she says, "Stephanie, I know you're scared that Jonathan's not here, but you're in good hands. You're fine." And, you know, it's, what are you going to do? Right? You are gurneying down to the room that they're entering, that's going to give life to my son and take mine. So they prepare you. And for any of you who have witnessed your wife giving birth, or have been privy to deliver a baby, you know, through C-section, you're in a T shape, you know, with your arms down. You are cold. There is a curtain in front of your face, so you don't see what's going to happen as they cut you. And it gets eerily quiet. And when they put soap on the belly, they have to wait like 3 minutes, and they look at the clock before they start the incision. And in that moment, I feel like I scared myself out of my body, because I don't remember from that point on. So they deliver a healthy, happy baby boy, and seconds later, I'm dead. And then everything happened. All chaos ensued. Like you said, I ended up having an amniotic fluid embolism, which is a very rare 1 in 40,000 risk, where amniotic cells get into the mother's bloodstream. And if you happen to be allergic to it, your body goes into anaphylactic shock. And in most cases, you don't make it. The first part of it is cardiac arrest. And then, so I flatlined for 37 seconds. They got me back up with the cart. They intubated me, taped my eyes shut. And then the second half of an AFE starts, which is your body's inability to clot blood. It's called DIC, disseminated coagulopathy, something like, I can't even, the words don't roll off, but anesthesiologists will have named that acronym "Death is Coming." So your body normally has 20 units of blood. I was given 60 units of blood and blood product to save my life. And of O negative, that is, I can only receive O negative blood. So the fact that I was in a hospital that had enough O negative blood to keep me above ground is shocking in of itself. Once they stabilized me, they thought that everything was stabilized. They transferred me into the surgical ICU and they put me on life support. So I was in a medically induced coma at that point, and that's when Jonathan arrived. So Jonathan texted the doctor and said, how's everything going? And he's like, she's like, Jacob's great, Stephanie's stable. And he's smart enough to know that that's not good. So in the consultation with anesthesia, the anesthesiologist explained what an AFE is. Don't look it up. Don't bother looking it up.
This is you. Right?
Yeah, I can show. Yeah, I have a bigger. I can. Yeah. So this here, I'll share. I did pull. Let me see. Let's share the desktop so you can see you, and then. So that's how my husband's. So you see me now, makeup, hair, and everything else. And this is how I looked. I still looked obviously pregnant, but that is complete fluid. That's edema. I had kidney failure in the ICU. And so the doctors said to Jonathan, don't look up what an amniotic fluid embolism is. If you see it, it's basically a widower's site. Like everything is about loss. If you've heard of an AFE, you know someone who has died. And so he comes in, he sees this, the machines are breathing for me. And then he goes to the anesthesiologist if she needs a hysterectomy. This is the doctor we met with. And she thought that that was unusual. She's like, why would you meet with a doctor about hysterectomy? But, she's stable right now. And, I don't remember what they said. She wouldn't survive another surgery, or they said, she doesn't need it. But at the time I didn't. And then so Jonathan stayed by my side and then saw the brand new baby. So he's seeing life and life clinging to life. And so that was a real conflict. And plus all of whatever happens in his mind of this is what she said was going to happen. 7 hours later, I'm still bleeding and they call in the gynecologist to perform the hysterectomy. They do the pathology on the uterus and it showed that an accreta had started to form, but it was where it was located. The MRI didn't pick it up. And so everything happened exactly the way I said it would. About 6 days later, they have no determination about, I was oxygenated, but they have no determination what kind of deficit I was under and what happened afterwards. So, they take you off of the meds to see if I'm conscious, if I know what happened, where I am. And as they extubate me, the very first thing I see, because I'm, I had kidney failure and I still look, so I look down at my swollen belly and I'm like, am I still fucking pregnant? Like that was the very first thing I said. So Jonathan laughs like, she's going to be okay. So it was a rough, I was in the hospital for a month and, going through everything, I am now one of the highest acuity cases in the hospital. Every department had their hands on me, in me, around me. So from cardiology to nephrology to hematology. And so they would have their residents, it's a teaching hospital. So they would have their residents come over and say, we see the chart, we see the history. How did you know?
And it's not only that, right? I mean, the premonition is one thing. The second thing is that you saw somehow what was happening.
I did, but I'll get it. Yeah. So, I mean, in the process, so I had all of this so that how did you know? I said, I'm in a teaching hospital, you tell me. And they said, well, foreboding exists prior to an embolus or a heart attack, but moments before, maybe a day before, but 3 months before in the detail that you had it, no. And so one doctor who is on the board of directors there was like, I think you need to go spiritual on this one. And, none of that made sense to my husband. He's like, I don't know what they're talking about. And I'm like, I went to traditional therapy because it took a while to get out of a wheelchair and recover and put a sentence together to be able to read books. But when I was recovering physically, mentally, emotionally, I was shell-shocked. And so I would go to therapy and they would be like, how can we help you? And I said, well, you can help me first by telling me how it is I saw it before it happened. And they would be like, let's just worry about the trauma. Let's worry about getting you out of trauma. I said, that doesn't work for me. It's because if, what happens if, the one thing I feel I was terrified of is, what if I manifested this? Like, what if this was a self-fulfilling prophecy? What if I said it over and over and over again, that ultimately I didn't? I came to the conclusion, just for you all to know, that I didn't. I can't force myself to hemorrhage or force myself to need a hysterectomy or force my organs to combine. But it took a long process to do that. And so I ended up finding a regression therapist. If you've ever read the book, Many Lives, Many Masters by Dr. Brian Weiss, he talks about regression and how certain traumatic moments are stored like film strips in your brain. And sometimes one uses regression or hypnotherapy to access those film strips when you're in a meditative state. I'd never been hypnotized before. I'm totally type A, if you can't figure that out by now. And so being able to be hypnotized over video conference, I didn't have high hopes for it. But I'll show you a little clip of that and what came out of it afterwards. So let me share my screen.
Did you tell your husband, I told you so?
I didn't.
Again, I told you so.
Yeah, I didn't, because he was like,
Shocked.
he definitely he won't admit, and like you could see on the Netflix thing, he'll stick to his way of thinking, but he definitely believes now that something else is going on. He just won't go down that rabbit hole with me, because he's got, in his mind, he's like, his brain is to capacity. He doesn't need to figure out something that he feels is existential that he'll never have answers to. So what you're looking here is the hypnotherapy with my therapist. It took about 30 hours for her to get me back into the OR. So we went through many different versions of this. I had zero desire to know about my past life, because there's no way to prove it unless I could speak a completely foreign language immediately. It didn't do me of any service. What I wanted to know was there a way to see anything that was around me? During those 3 months, I had seen anything? Was there something I was unaware of that might have been around? And what happened in those 37 seconds? So what you are going to hear right now is just before I flatline.
I explained to Stephanie, it's going to happen very quickly, and I'm going to embrace you, and I'm going to hold on to you, and I'm not going to let go. And then thinking around about sure. She's turning blue. She went flat. And it's done. My body just collapsed.
So
I don't think we heard at some point. So
you what?
I'm not sure there was volume at some point.
Oh, could you not hear it?
No, at some point I think we lost. I wasn't sure if you thought of the thing.
Oh, okay. No, I heard it on my end. So I'll send you the link to that and you guys can look at that. But the what ended up happening was so in that video, I'm sorry, the audio didn't come through, but I went into the ER. So what she's doing is, you know, with this regression, you are an observer in your own movie. And so what I am seeing in that moment is Stephanie's body as the one who's giving birth, the observer Stephanie, who's the one that's talking and walking through the scene and saying what I'm seeing. And then there was the spirit Stephanie. When I flatlined, it was like a shooting star. So, you know, sometimes people will say, oh, did you see the light? I'm like, I don't know. They gave me a lot of drugs. I have no idea, you know, so, but the reality is that if I was the spirit form of me, then maybe I would have, because of what I saw. Like everything went from, a monotone, like the hospital green kind of with a sepia into like a bright white. So, and I explained after I flatlined that the first crash cart didn't work, but there was a second crash cart, that my doctor didn't deliver the baby, which nurse jumped on my chest to give me CPR and broke my ribs, you know, who hit the button for the code, what my daughter was doing in the labor and delivery room. It was a complete out of body experience. And then I saw hundreds of spirits, and I was on the Today Show and they were asking things. And I said, you know what? I processed all of this in one way. Once I had this session and I cried it out, you know, I felt better. It was like, I don't know, you know, it just was this kind of release. So of course it's quite graphic, and Jonathan doesn't want to see his wife in pain, but he takes a second look at the video and he's like, how do you know this isn't a recalled episode of Grey's Anatomy in your head? I called him a lot of names, people. It was not pleasant during this time, but in all fairness, it is a fair statement, right? You can mix up TV shows. This is hypnotherapy. You have no idea what you saw. And by the way, this was a traumatic experience and I had been heavily medicated for months. So I go back to the therapist and I said, how do you know what I'm saying is true? And she says, well, sometimes the only validation we get is the patient feels better and you feel better. I said, that's not good enough for me. I have witnesses. So I took the video back to the doctors who were present. And of course, at that point, Jonathan's like, I'm going with you. I don't want this edited. I want to hear what they're going to say and everything else. So I said to the OB, I said, you didn't deliver the baby. And Jonathan, of course, interjects and he's like, of course she did. There was blood all over her scrub. She was there. I said, she was there, but she didn't deliver the baby. Julie, were you there to deliver the baby? I was there, but I didn't deliver the baby. I said, can I ask a question before you tell me who delivered the baby? Because this wouldn't be in my medical records. I said, the resident gyn-onc, the one taking the notes with the gyn-onc who was telling me, oh, were you on the internet? The resident taking the notes, did she deliver the baby? And Jonathan's like, what? Why would she deliver the baby? She was gyn-onc rotation and everything. And I said, Julie, was she the one that delivered the baby? And she looks at me and she said, how do you know that? She said, about 15 minutes as we prepped you in the back hallways, like in the corridors and labor and delivery, we're a teaching hospital. So we invite residents to come in all the time and assist on deliveries. And yes, she delivered the baby. So I was like, all right, check on that one, because I wouldn't know that. And then the second thing was this nurse came over and said, Mrs. Arnold, I'm so happy to see she's in management. And I said, and this was a year later, like 10 months later. So she's like, I'm so happy to see you are doing so well. You wouldn't know me, but I said, you're the one who broke my ribs. And she stopped and she said, and I'd do it again to save your life. And I was told later by the head nurse that she went back to her office and cried because I shouldn't know that. And then all the other things from the second crash cart being there was not in my medical files. And the anesthesiologist has said, yeah, the first crash cart wouldn't get up. And so I had to actually verify that what you were saying was real, because you'd think I would remember it, but we were all traumatized. It was heavy adrenaline during that moment. So I had to ask the other anesthesiologist who was there with me. And she's like, yeah, there was a second cart brought in.
So you knew stuff that there's no way you could have.
There's no way I could have known, right? So and then yeah.
Yeah.
No, and then
Go ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying you're gonna get there anyway, because you even knew things people thought and didn't say, which is even crazier.
Right. So I kept saying, I kept saying to my doctor, I said, did you say this can't be happening? This can't be happening. And she said, I did, but under my breath, under the mask, by your feet, there's no way you could have heard me. It was almost in my head. And I was like, how does it, so the beautiful thing about having all of this evidence or this data is that my doctors have changed the way they practice medicine. One of the takeaways from my OB and my anesthesiologist was that when one goes through crisis and traumas like this, they're treating the body. They're trying to get, the body back up and the organs all started again, but they're forgetting that the spirit is present. They're forgetting that consciousness does exist. And they didn't know from this, nor do they study it, nor do they, even pay attention to it. But the fact of the matter is that when something like this happens and you are acutely aware of what's happening in this kind of out-of-body experience, there's no way that you can deny it. So therefore, they treat the patient differently, and that is going to help save lives. So when you're talking about these knowings that one has, I say lean into it, because what's the worst that could happen? You will never regret speaking up and being wrong, but you 100% will regret not speaking up and being dead right. So is it worth staying quiet if it can save your life? I don't think so. So, everybody's like, after the 10th doctor said you were crazy and everything else, I would have shut up. And I said, then you would have stayed dead. Because what ended up happening and what saved my life, which I didn't get to, was, there was one thing I did not predict. There was extra blood and there was a crash cart in the operating room waiting, which they do not do for a C-section. A C-section, they'll have 6 units of blood, but not 12 or not 20. And there was extra blood there and there was a crash cart. And later I asked, and my anesthesiologist said, well, the consultation that I had with the anesthesia said, it startled me when I hung up the phone with you. And it made me nervous and I just felt something. And she flagged my file and incorporated this extra measures in the operating room at the time of delivery. And that is what saved my life. So had the blood not been there, had the crash cart even in the emergency and the second one brought in, I most certainly wouldn't have survived as well as I survived. Because Jonathan's like, well, if you believe in predetermination or you believe in free will, then you were always going to survive. I said, maybe. I said, but I believe that free will and predetermination are on 2 different paths. You can be predetermined to expire at a certain date. Fine, no problem. I don't know what that date is. And maybe I was always going to survive, but how well I survived was due to my free will. If I didn't speak up, maybe I would have been a vegetable for the rest of my life, but I would have survived.
Wow. And when you say spirits, what you think was spirits, what does that look like, or why do you think that that's what you saw?
Yeah, so one of the sessions that I had, I saw hundreds of spirits. Now because I don't believe that time and space exist in this other dimension, if you will. I believe that when we die and consciousness exists, we're all made up of energy. So energy transitions from a solid to energy, to gas, like not gas, but you know what I'm saying. And so that energy is still around us. And so in one of my therapy sessions, I saw past relatives who I've loved very much. And, on the Today Show, I said, okay, I know Psychology Today says, of course, when you're traumatized, You want to see your loved ones. Of course, when you're going through a near-death experience, you want to have your loved ones there. It's a nice wishful thinking. And it's okay, let's put a pin in the ones I don't know, or the ones I know. Let's talk about the ones I don't know. And I saw Jonathan's father, who had died in 1998. And there was a message that he had that I would have never known. And there was also my best friend's little brother, who was 7 when he died. And there was a message there that I wouldn't have known. And I said, I don't know. And I write about this in the book, but I said, I don't know if this means anything. And ultimately, when it came true, like when it actually was the message, I was like, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know why or how. I've been searching for years now, like how does this work? What are the mechanics to make it work? How long does one have when you have an intuitive moment? How do you actually know this knowing? Like what is the mechanism by which we know it? I think I will be searching my whole life, but
look, talking from your husband's perspective, I would have probably said something like, maybe when you're brain dead or about to become, there's a stage where you do see that light and all of that, because it's something in the brain that that's what happens, and that makes me ask you, I've seen the trailer for Surviving Death. I've seen the first episode. There are some stories. There's one guy there that says that he almost died, and then he went up and saw his father, who he never could talk to while he was alive. And then his father was, he managed to talk to him, and his father told him, go back to your body. And he says, no. And then he said, by the way, if it was me, I would probably see my mother. She would scream at me for things I haven't done. And I'll be like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to leave it. But that sounds to me crazy. Does that sound to you after you've seen that? When you look at the other stories, do you say now, you know what? Yeah.
So I have, there's certain things when I look at mediums and psychics and clairvoyance, and I'm like, okay, that's far-fetched, or, but I don't, it's so odd, because I went to, I think I was 18, I went to a Turkish coffee reader, and she was Israeli. So in order to do Turkish coffee readings, you actually have to drink the coffee, and then they read
very good coffee. Yeah.
Right. It's terrible if you're not a coffee drinker. So it's like, it's heavy. It's like, but you have to drink it. And then they turn the cup upside down, and then they read the coffee grinds. And, she says to me, it'll be a long and windy road to get married. But then she says, you will die at an early age. And, and I'm like, you're not supposed to tell people this, but I don't believe it anyway. It was just more for entertainment, and it was my friend's grandmother who was doing this for fun. And then I have to think back. I'm like, maybe some people have the ability to see. We talk about, biblical stories. We talk about history, and we talk about seers in the world. We talk about people that have these abilities. I don't poo-poo them anymore. I've experienced things one too often, and premonitions continue to happen. I think if there's a gift that I have, I do not consider myself a clairvoyant. I consider myself more like a medical intuitive. Like I feel things off of people, but I could, their thing, I would never couch it by saying, this is what this is. I'd be like, worst case scenario, you take some blood work up and you see what's wrong, but what are you feeling? But you already have these answers within you. It's just, they want to seek out other people to validate. And that's why I think these psychics get the reputation that they get. But there are people that have the ability to see what I saw with my husband's father. He had a coin, and by the way, when Simon & Schuster rejected me, HarperCollins bought the book rights, but when Simon & Schuster rejected me, they were like, she didn't die long enough to make it compelling. And I was like, that's not, I have a friend. So I'm like, that goes up there. But what I saw in this vision was that he had a coin, and it was a foreign coin, and I had the details to the coin, and he was wearing a type of jacket, and I was like, explaining all this. And I never met the man. And so sure, we can say, okay, maybe she picked up a coin from someplace else. Maybe she saw a picture of him with a jacket. Okay, fine, no problem. But I went through all the details, and I kept asking everybody in the family about the coin. And so everybody said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. My husband was like, tell my father. I said, hi, very, joking it off. And then ultimately it turned out his younger brother was like, you found a coin, or you were talking about a coin? He's like, it's funny you should say that. I was going through one of Dad's old suitcases the other day, and in the crevice of the suitcase, there was a coin. I said, can you describe it to me? And it was almost verbatim, this coin. And in that moment, I knew exactly what the message was. And it turned out that his father had his fatal heart attack with this brother in London. And this son has always felt that he could have done something else to save his father's life. And the coin is from Croatia. And it was the very last time that they were together in one of those memories where he said, I want you to focus on the happier times and those memories, because there's nothing you could have done. And it changed his perspective on those things. Now, how would I have known that? I have no idea of knowing.
I'll tell you one thing. I think I mentioned that to you when we had a call. I always have this part where I'm telling something about myself that makes more people not join our sessions again. But it's interesting because it's funny. As somebody who's very practical, I guess like your husband, that's very like, we'll find an explanation to everything. So when I was, I think 17, 18, so I dated this girl in the States. And then she broke up with me. Many have. She was one of many. And then we came back. She came to, I went back to Israel. And then a week later, she was to come to Israel. And I don't know why, but I was really like, wanted her back. So as the shallow 17 people we are, I don't know, maybe you guys were deeper. We were pretty shallow. I was going out with my cousin, who's beautiful. She is amazingly beautiful. And I said to myself, gee, I wish she would be here to see that and think I'm dating her. She would go crazy. Now, I had no idea where she is in Israel, in which city, at which hour, at which club, or at which bar. Yeah. I went to this bar in Tel Aviv. We went together, me and my cousin, and we went really to hang out. And then I'm sitting there on the bar. And then really, after like half an hour, I'm looking to my left, not even to my back. And there were 3 empty seats on the bar. And on the 4th, there she was. And she was just looking at me, and I was like, hey, what's up? What are you doing here? Of course, the next day, as we are all very shallow young people, that's what makes us tick. She called me, asking, wow, what's going on? Who were you with? And I was like, how could that happen? How could me wanting her to be there watching me happen? I mean, what are the chances? We weren't in touch.
Right.
I told you that. So that's where I was like,
you look, once you start seeing the signs, and I believe this, like once you're aware of the signs, they are around, and whether you want to shut them off, you can. It doesn't mean that they're not there. It's like I don't know if you were like when you're getting married, all of a sudden you see magazines with weddings everywhere, and you're like, this is such a coincidence. And no, there's always been magazines with weddings, just when everybody's getting married at any given time. That is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is like, you are innocent. Like I explained to you yesterday, we're house hunting, and it's in a completely different state. And my miracle child, Jacob, we walk into this house. He's like, Mommy, this is our house. And I said, well, it's a nice house. It's overpriced, so it's not our house, And so he's like, no, it's our house. And I'm like, okay, fine, whatever. Where's your bank account? So we leave the house and we go look at other houses. This house is kind of calling to me. So I'm like, oh, let's go see it one more time. And we go while we're taking notes, and we walk in the house, and Jacob says, Mommy, look in the kitchen. And I said, what? And I look in the kitchen, there's a book in the middle of the kitchen island. There's nothing. There's food. And then there's 3 books. There's a book on obesity. There is a National Geographic magazine. And then there's 37 seconds.
wow.
And I stopped for a second. And of course, my husband, the logical side, he's like, honey, they had to call us into the gate 3 days ago. They probably Googled you and bought your book and whatever it is. I was like, no, okay, that's fine. I said to the broker, I said, can you do me a favor and ask the owner, how she came about this book? And she's like, why? I said, because I wrote it. And so she's like, are you kidding me? She's like, I just got chills. I said, yeah, so did I. I said, can you just, and I said, and my son noticed out of there's a unicorn, there's basketball court. He noticed the book. And so she goes back to the broker, or she goes back to the seller, and the seller says, I bought that book a few weeks ago. I read it from cover to cover, but I don't know why I put it in the kitchen today.
Wow.
And so I was like, okay, this might be our house. I'm gonna wait, but it might, so I'm like, okay, that is something so random that like, what are the chances, right? So, yeah.
So what's next for you now? I mean, you've been in the production world, then this changes your life and you talk about it and you write a best-selling book that guys you can buy on Amazon. What's next?
Yeah, so I optioned the screenplay. So Hawk Koch, who is the president of the Academy Awards, is my producer on the movie. We are in the process of packaging it and meeting with directors, and who knows, these things take years. So I'm like, at one point I was like, let's make it happen. And then on the other hand, I'm like, when the timing is right, because there have been different versions of wanting to do this as a scripted series or a movie. I'm launching a podcast called Knowing with Echoverse, which the people that produce the Netflix series are in it. So we have are producing it. So I say that will probably launch maybe sometime next year. And then another book when it calls to me. I don't want to write a book for the sake of just writing a book, not just only because writing books are hard, but I don't want to write a book just for the sake of, hey, here's the next book in a trilogy, because it's my true life. So if I have something to say, I'll write it.
Amazing. So listen, first of all, you're a very brave woman. I have to tell you, women in general, I think when I have a root canal, I don't sleep for and you guys give birth, it's like, holy hell, wow. I mean, that's crazy. And that's a fascinating story. I mean, I'm sure there's way more we can talk about, and hopefully, we'll see you talk about it at one of our conferences. I will just say that Chicago, where we met, that's where we do our first conference this year on November 8th. Sam Zell will be speaking. Zach Williams, the son of the legendary Robin Williams, will talk about mental health issues and amazing collaborators. I think it's going to be the largest effort, at least in the family office scene in Chicago. And by the way, when I came to Chicago, your town, I always like to check what the locals eat, and everybody told me you got to try that. How do you call that round pizza? That crazy round.
Yeah, deep dish, right?
Deep dish. And I'm like, really, if pizza and soup would combine, this is what it would be.
Right.
So I hope it was healthy, but it was very interesting. So
good.
You guys have the popcorn, right?
Yep.
So Stephanie, it was a real pleasure. I really appreciate your time. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you so much. People can check out a lot of the clips or the Netflix stuff. They can go to stephaniearnold.net and see more of the information that I'm doing. And I love speaking. So if it works for messaging, but intuition, really, if you think about in your relationships you've had or in your businesses, you feel if things are right, even if the data, even on paper, if that love is supposed to be like great, you just know. And I think that we don't trust it enough. And I think when you have a life and death situation where you've learned to trust it, you don't deny it anymore. So I hope it helps somebody who's watching today.
Of course, and we will send the recording of this session to everybody, including those who didn't attend but registered, and your website to everybody, so everybody can go and check it out. And that's that. We're trying to survive the summer. Next month actually is Israel. September, I think 21st, we do our conference in Tel Aviv.
Wow.
The office, and then November 3rd, New York, 8th, Chicago, 22nd, London with Sherry Blair and other great people. And the 28th is the fun pre-Art Basel conference.
That's nice.
Conference in Miami Beach. That's where we always close the year. So that's what we have in store for you, everybody. Stephanie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.